This is Steve Schmidt at The Warning. We are pleased to be able to join with all of you this morning and talk about these momentous days, what's happening in the world. And I'm thrilled to introduce you to Claire Berlinski. She writes a fantastic Substack, one of my favorites, one of the first things I read every morning, The Cosmopolitan Globalist. She is a veteran journalist. She has lived all over the world, covered the world. She is an American in Paris, where she is joining us this morning. Welcome, Claire.
Thank you so much. What a lovely introduction. I had no idea you read me at all, no less that I was going to be introduced that way by you. I wish my mom could have heard that.
When I read you, I think about a very specific story, and it's captured in a trilogy about Franklin Roosevelt as commander-in-chief in the war. And late in his presidency, 1944, his close friend, the Canadian Prime Minister, Mackenzie King, has come to the White House. He's in residence there, as Winston Churchill would be through long periods during the Second World War. King and Roosevelt talking late into the night. Mackenzie King is very aware that he's in the presence of a world historical figure, and he was a meticulous diarist. He returns to his room in the White House and he records the conversation. And what FDR talked to him about that night was the birth of the United Nations, the UN Charter, the UN Declaration of Human Rights. He talked about the world as it moved past its colonial period. He talked about the architecture of what we understand today as the American-led liberal global order, which you explained so well. And Franklin Roosevelt says to Mackenzie King that his aspiration is that this will endure for as long as everybody who is alive on the day the war is won is still alive. The youngest of those people are 78 years old. And the last thing that Mackenzie King wrote that night was that FDR said nothing lasts forever. And so here we are. How do you, as an American in Paris, deeply experienced covering the world, alive through the period of Pax Americana, the fall of the wall, through now the third year of a war in Ukraine, or an escalated war in Ukraine is probably a better way to put that, that has a casualty level that on the Russian side is north of 600,000 men. And I think there's a real lack of understanding. The more people you lose, the more committed you become. It's much, much easier to start a war than to figure out how to stop one. And it's much easier to escalate a war than it is to stop one. And so with that, how do you see things at this moment in time?
I think that what you said from the outset, that the order that was established in the wake of the Second World War was something that was known. All of our grandparents understood this instinctively. They lived through it. They saw it. They were participants in it. And their children understood it through osmosis. Grandchildren maybe a little bit less, often a lot less. This generation has no idea. So what I experience looking at this is a frantic sense that I see what's going on. I know what it means. I know what it means as a historian. I know what it means as someone who does remember what her grandparents told her extremely well, but I can't make other people understand. And that is it's a terrible feeling. It's a terrible feeling to be unable to get other people to see what I'm seeing. And I do my best, but I also have to realize that I'm very powerless. I don't have the ability to speak to 300 million Americans and say, look, you've got to believe me here. We've seen this before. I've seen it before in my life, or I've seen parts of it before in my life. You don't want to do this. You don't want to go down this path. And the path by which I mean several different paths. I mean the path we're going down with Donald Trump, but also the path we're going down with our foreign policy. So I experience it as terrifying. Um, I forgot to mention the global rise of anti-Semitism as well. Three things that I experienced as just terrifying, but also as incredibly impotent.
I was talking about this to a friend of mine a couple weeks back, and the big thing, and I knew this intellectually was occurring and happening, but emotionally, I think had a real lack of awareness. The big difference between the world that I grew up in and the world that my children have grown up in. At first glance, I might say technology is the differentiator, but I think it is the lack of presence of that World War II generation.
Yeah.
They're all
Yeah.
gone.
The two.
The the principal of my elementary school, whether it's apocryphal or not, but he was a D-Day combat soldier. They were ubiquitous, they were everywhere, and they understood. I think they would have understood what Trump was. Now, when you process this situation and you try to appreciate the danger, the simple fact is, in this moment, there doesn't seem to be anybody in public life in an elected office, high office, who's able to consistently, constantly, with patience, explain what's happening. And
No.
so when I think about the American education system, I think about in 2005, when I was in the Bush White House, the first thing I did was a foreign trip, and it was the 60th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz. And Elie Wiesel was on that trip. And Tom Lantos, the survivor of one of the camps, the great Democratic congressman championing human rights from Los Angeles, from California, and his wife, a Holocaust survivor, Mrs. Lantos, was on that trip. And I felt such a incredible moral obligation in the aftermath of that trip to take seriously the bearing of witness and the obligations of memory. So I think about like school. For me, I think by kindergarten on the third or fourth day, they probably could have identified, so this kid's not going to be a physicist, right? He's right. He's not going to be inventing medicines. I can't imagine that there's a singularly more important thing to understand than what occurred in the 20th century, to make sure that it can't occur again. And within the living lifetime of these events, at the end, there's a story in the paper about a 102-year-old man, one of the last survivors of the attack on Pearl Harbor, just died. But within the living memory, there are still survivors of the camps. There are still combat veterans who will be at the 80th anniversary of the landings at D-Day. A great wave of amnesia has settled over much of the West. Is it a disease of decadence? Is it a design function of a democracy, of a free people, that you simply cannot make a prosperous people remember the sacrifices, the connection between point A to point B, how we got to where we are today? I talked to my wife about this, the idea of, look at the road. Why is there a road? Who built the road? Does anyone ever think about why that road was built and by who and when?
I think it is possible, but I don't think we did what we should have done. I think that the people who lived through the first half of the 20th century believed they had lived through something so unforgettable, so cataclysmic, that it was something like the crucifixion. It would live on in memory forever, and it didn't need to be passed on with any special awareness of doing so beyond existing and doing the things that they would normally do. So scholarship was confined to the academy, and the academy was then, we know what's happened to the academy. The academy went insane somewhere about 20 years ago. So it's not being transmitted through that route anymore. And the chain of transmission just stopped with around the third generation, replaced by a whole lot of really stupid intellectual fads so that students aren't really taught in school anymore. If they are taught, they're taught very superficially. They're taught in such a way that they understand that the word Nazi is a synonym for bad, but they don't know anything about what the Nazis were, what they did. They know nothing about Stalin. They know nothing about Mao. They know nothing about the war beyond the very basics. They know nothing about the fate of the Jews. Some survey data suggests that 1 in 5 young people doubts that the Holocaust happened. So I mean, this is just staggering. This is just staggering. And we haven't done a good job of preserving the salient lessons of that period of history and passing them on in a systematic way. We've passed them on piecemeal. So people like me, my grandfather was he was in the French Foreign Legion. He fought the Nazis. My grandparents, refugees from the Nazis after France fell. And I had the good fortune they lived to a very old age. My grandmother was 101 when she died. So I got to speak to them even as an adult. And this was all very living for me, even when I was old enough to be able to study this period at school and speak to them simultaneously. But how many Americans get to do that? It was just good luck in my case that they lived for so long. Most people don't have that opportunity. And I think they do a better job in France. One of the reasons I think that France has a better historic memory is an interesting one. It's the physical memorials. We don't have memorials in every single village in the United States showing the names of everyone who died in the First World War. And we didn't lose as many people per capita in the First World War. But in France, even the smallest village, you see memorials in the center of the town where the list of names goes on so long you can't believe that there were ever even that many people there in the first place because it's a dead little village now. I think that makes a big difference, physically preserving the memory of these things in such a way that everyone has to see them every time they walk outside to get a loaf of bread. The insistence that this should be central to the school curriculum. It's astonishing how little Americans know. It's astonishing how little, and the survey data is just incredibly depressing, how little Americans know about their own history, still less European history or Asian history. We've accepted that we don't educate our kids. And I don't know why we find this acceptable. We're falling behind in all the international competitive scores in math and physics, but we're also just allowing kids to grow up completely ignorant of their own history. And there are a lot of, we can discuss the reasons for that, but above all, it's a low standard. It's a low standard. Parents are accepting it for their kids in school. They're not, schools are, I think we lost a generation of very committed school teachers and very competent school teachers when women entered the workforce, because that's teaching school was one of the only options, professional options available to women for until a couple generations ago. And we never really thought, what does this mean? And how do we compensate for it? How do we make sure that our kids are educated by people who are just as good as they were? And we have a culture that accepts ignorance as being perfectly acceptable and is deeply skeptical of people who are more knowledgeable.
I was in Poland a couple of months back, and I've written about it on the Warning. And there's a article in a newspaper from contemporaneous to that trip. President of Poland, Donald Tusk, is being interviewed, and the story starts off. There's a picture in his office, and the picture is from August 31st, 1939, the day before the Second World War starts. And it starts 5 kilometers from where that picture is taken, where his family is on the river. And what Donald Tusk says in this interview is he addresses the young people of Poland directly, and he says, "I have bad news. You're going to have to fight. We're in a pre-war phase. It's coming. And it's astonishing to read. It's a heavyweight European military. We won't go into it now, but the Poles fight and fought ferociously like no other people in occupied Europe. As you talked about the monuments across France, there are monuments everywhere. In Warsaw and Poland, where the Polish Home Army fought back against the Nazis, where the Jews rose up against the Nazis in the ghetto. But no American politician would obviously say that to America's young people, who certainly aren't prepared to hear it. But I want to look ahead to January 20th of 2025. And I'll ask you in a second, who do you think Donald Trump is going to win this election?
I fear he will. I don't know. I don't know. I'm not going to pretend to know. I
What does your gut tell you?
My gut is not reliable here. My gut said there was no way he could possibly win the first time. My gut said that the American people would never countenance for a second the idea of putting someone like Donald Trump in office. And my gut still says there's no possible way that after everything we've seen, they'll put him in office again. But my gut is not reliable. And there's a lot of wishful thinking involved. And I see Biden just looks so old and so frail, and he is so incapable of articulating what he is trying to do or why, or what's going on or why. Every time he gets through a speech without it being an absolute disaster, I feel like, after, like watching an Olympic gymnast land a particularly complex vault, especially like one of those really young, fragile looking gymnasts where you just think, oh, thank God. And that's not good. I mean, politics it's pretty obvious that people vote for the alpha, right? They vote for the one who looks like it's like the biggest orangutan and who's beating his chest the most loudly. And I just don't think most Americans are, for some reason, I don't get this, because to me it's so obvious that Trump is absolutely incapable of managing anything, that he's stupid, he's ignorant, and he has no idea what the office of the presidency is supposed to be about. He's already got, we already had 1 million plus Americans dead on his watch. It doesn't seem to make any difference. But I think he looks to many people like the more vibrant one. And I think they've forgotten. I can't believe I'm saying this. I'm talking about other Americans as if they're mentally handicapped children, but that's the way it looks like to me. It looks, if you're going to put him in office twice, that's exactly how you have to be described. If I had to bet, I guess I'd bet on Biden winning. I think just barely, because the reasons not to put Trump in office are so overwhelming. I have to believe that a slight majority of American adults understand how suicidal it would be to put Trump back in office.
Let's talk about
What about you?
where I am right now is my head tells me Trump wins. My faith tells me he loses. And we're at a moment right now where the race has to change in its composition. The pro-Biden coalition is gone. It's dead. Like a plant in your backyard. You can water it, you can do whatever you want to it. It's not sick, it's dead, it's gone. And so what remains is not two paths through the proverbial wood, but one. And that one path is an anti-Trump coalition that frankly is indifferent around the Biden presidency, right? Because that coalition includes people who have no expectation of 4 more years of Joe Biden. And every time they hear him being compared to Franklin Roosevelt by someone on his team, it pisses them off.
Mm.
They'll accept it. They'll vote for him. They would vote for him in a cryogenic tank hooked up to an artificial life support system against Trump, which is where I am. Right, because there is only one issue. The entire society, and the society is a civilization that's distinct. And you write so beautifully and brilliantly about this. But the American civilization, as an organism, is, when you strip it down, is completely dependent on the assignment of temporary lawful political power through an election process.
Yeah, we don't have a backup.
If you take that away, the civilization itself collapses. The entire project has been architected around that one beautiful advancement in the annals of the total story of human civilization. That was the genius of the American founders, and that's imperiled. And I think that people are very disappointed in the choice. I believe that people procrastinate on things that are unpleasant. And so I think that explains a lot of the lack of engagement in the election right now. I think the stakes of this debate in June just could not be higher. I think it's the highest stakes political event of my lifetime. And I don't think the media has adequately framed it as that. Former president and a successor. Former president is is a convicted felon. Who is giving Vladimir Putin a green light to invade European countries. So I think though that if the election were tomorrow, I know that Trump would win. The
Yeah.
good news is, right, there's 157 days to go, and that's a very long time in politics. But what I wanted to ask is, envisioning him winning, talk to me about what happens in Europe. How does Putin see Ukraine? We would certainly cut off arms to Ukraine. How does the Ukrainian story then come to its end game? And what happens next? What is the 4 years of opportunity in Europe?
If Ukraine loses, and I think that's what Trump would facilitate, that's what he's threatened to do, cut off arms and say, we're going to solve this in 24 hours. What else could he mean besides Ukraine loses? We will see the biggest genocide in Europe we've seen since the Holocaust. And I don't think that the rest of Europe, or at least Eastern and Central Europe, is prepared to let that happen without a fight. But I also don't think they're prepared for a fight. They need another 10 years for that. And many are beginning down the path of rearmament and preparation for that, but it's going to be sooner than they can do it. It's going to depend a lot on what happens in the French election, who's in power here. Macron has been trying to position himself as, the French president has been trying to position himself as the leader who can take the place of the United States in unifying Europe behind the French banner. But it's a little hard for other countries to accept, because at the outset of the conflict, this most certainly wasn't the role that France was playing. France is the only nuclear power in the EU right now, and that's extremely important. Whether France is actually willing to make Paris the target of a first strike, I don't know. I think there will be a race toward nuclear proliferation the moment Trump's victory is announced. It will be so fast. It will be one country after another. We're going to be, every country that can nuke up will enter into a agreement with a country that it believes can protect it, and it's not going to be the United States.
Would that be the first move in Europe as a result, that the French and the British, would it be them together, would extend their nuclear umbrella over the European Union?
I don't know. It might not be the whole European Union. I think the big question is whether Germany would feel that it's essential to have a bomb under its own control, or whether there would be some sort of Eurobomb arrangement, which is what they're talking about now. But I think there is now a sense throughout Europe that Europe must have its own nuclear deterrent, and it can't just be a French deterrent. There has to be some kind of sharing arrangement. How exactly this will manifest itself? I don't know, because obviously I'm not privy to the discussions when they talk about what are we going to do about this. The last thing they would invite me to listen to, but I'm seeing all the signs of the discussion being very active right now. I think if the UK were to extend its guarantee, I think it would be more likely to extend it to Northern Europe. And I think Sweden would be probably the country that would be most likely to superintend over a Nordic bomb or an Aurora Borealis bomb, the Baltics and Sweden and Norway and Denmark under its aegis, Finland too. But I'm not going to try and make a concrete prediction. I'm just saying this is what's going to happen. There's going to be a panic, and the only answer to that panic is a nuclear.
And 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 this has been the goal for the last 80 years to make sure that that never happened, that
Exactly.
there was a lack of nuclear weapons proliferation. And I want to get into this for
Exactly right.
everybody who's listening, and then we'll later watch this, which is the thing that is not explained that you explained so brilliantly. The United States of America pays more money than all of these other countries combined for the mutual defense of a system that benefits what country the most?
Hands up, everyone.
Right? Our country, and the purpose of this system that has endured for 80 years was built to keep what two countries demilitarized?
Exactly. Hands, everyone. And what do you think is going to happen when Japan and Germany announce that they're nuclear powers? You think that the wounds of the last war have been so forgotten by their neighbors that that won't cause an earthquake? Do you really think that Poland is going to be comfortable being between a nuclear Russia and a nuclear Germany without its own nuclear weapon? Do you really think China is going to respond to a nuclear Japan with equanimity? South Korea, North Korea? I mean, this is a. I think no one holds the sins of the fathers against Japan and Germany now. We see them as extremely democratic, peaceful, cooperative countries. They've been demilitarized. Well, not Japan, but they've been pacified. But there are wounds that never go away. There are suspicions that never go away. And while Americans are capable of forgetting history, you can't forget history if you're these countries' neighbors. And it's going to be the day that Germany performs its first nuclear test. We're in a world that no one can predict what happens next.
And of course, then across the Levant, there is
I know. I know.
a when you look at, and you lived in Istanbul for a long period, when you hear the Turkish president and his rhetoric, is that domestic politics in Turkey, or does he mean it?
What part?
His
Invading Israel?
hostility towards Israel and the
Oh,
Jews,
he
his opposition party, but where does he fit in this? How concerned should the Israelis be in the aftermath of the crash of the Iranian president? One American official said, it's hard to imagine that his replacement could conceivably be worse. But what do you see in that region of the world? And then how do you see that war combining with influencing the two other hotspots in the world, which of course is Ukraine and the South China Sea?
Here's what I think. When I think about the problem of massive nuclear proliferation, what worries me most isn't that anyone will deliberately start a nuclear war, because everyone understands that that's not winnable. It's the risk of accidents. Because when we had a bipolar system where only two powers had nuclear weapons, we know it is a matter of record. It is absolutely clear. We came damned close. We came so close so many times through accidents, through miscommunications, through the simple fact that you have, from the moment you get the warning the other side has launched, you've got 6 minutes to make a decision. there's only one country that I think would actually start a nuclear war in the full awareness of what would happen, and that's Iran. I really do not know whether that bomb would be under the control of people who would see it as worthwhile, a reasonable price to exchange themselves for getting rid of the Zionist entity. I doubt it. I think they can probably be deterred through the process, same process we deterred the Soviet Union through mutual assured destruction. But I'm just not sure, and that frightens me greatly. And I also think that precisely because of that, the risk of accidents is even higher. Once Iran gets the bomb, and it's going to stay on the threshold, I think, for quite some time, might even have one already, it's probably not going to announce that it's a nuclear power anytime soon. But as it becomes clear what they're planning to do, as it becomes clear that we're not planning to stop them, I think the Saudis will want one. I think the Turks will want one. And the risk of Egypt might even, the risk of an accident at that point is just stratospheric. It's just stratospheric. And with the level of tension in that region, the level of existential tension, and the lack of experience that these countries have in managing nuclear weapons, it just, I mean, I know what Turkish standards of construction are like. I just don't trust them to be able to build a system, a really foolproof system for not accidentally launching one of those bad boys, you know?
There is a fantastic series, and for everybody who's joined us this morning, it'll be watching. It's on Netflix, and it tells the history of the Cold War. There are two incredible stories in that Netflix series. And the first is Zbigniew Brzezinski, as President Carter's national security advisor, being awakened and told that the Soviet Union had launched its nuclear arsenal against the United States. He received a call because the screen had lit up. And his moment of reflection took place looking at his wife who was sleeping, and he recalled not wanting to wake her up. She'd be better off not knowing. It would be over very quickly. And he was getting ready to call President Carter to inform him that countdown had begun. Armageddon had arrived. Of course, the president would have the launch authority, and he got a call back that it was a malfunction. A 40-cent computer chip had malfunctioned. There's another story about the Soviet officer on night watch when they have a system malfunction. And I give him the most credit here for avoiding World War III. And this is really important to comprehend, right? This man saved the world, likely. And this was in the 1980s. And he saved the world because of deductive reasoning. It made no sense to him that if the United States was going to launch its nuclear weapons against Russia, that we would only launch 3 missiles. And there were only 3 missiles on the track. And because there were only 3 missiles coming, he decided not to report it up the chain and take the bet that it was a malfunction, which it was. And so when Claire talks about the thin line on these weapons, it is a very thin line, and there is a reality which we don't have enough time for to talk about today as we get into questions. But the conversation about artificial intelligence amazes me. And what amazes me about it is that obviously artificial intelligence will be weaponized. It will be a weapon, and it will be a powerful weapon. And that weapon, combined with the proliferation, combined with incompetency by how these governments function in a lot of countries, and even in the United States and Soviet Union, where there's really 80 years almost of history, or 70 years of history on the Soviet side of handling these weapons. You know, there's been mistakes as you get now into the other countries that, you know, that will handle them. And this was the stuff of nightmares. And This is what every American policymaker, British policymaker, every statesman and woman, between 1945 and the end of the Cold War tried to avoid, was the world coming into being that we're talking about. And the reason it's coming into being is because one man can make a difference, and that man is Donald Trump. And he has upended, through his ignorance and bombast, the understanding of how things function in the world and how peace and prosperity are kept. And as Claire pointed out, the ignorance is so astounding in the country as a whole. No one sees it for what it is. With that, let me bring in Lisa to moderate questions from our audience.
Claire, I'm going to start with you. Can you explicate further on what you mean about genocide if Putin wins in Ukraine? Is it from this nuclear weapon path, or are there other paths?
No, I think that Putin has made it absolutely explicit that he doesn't believe Ukraine should exist as an entity. He has kidnapped a number of Ukrainian children. We don't know how many, but it's probably upwards of 100,000 children have been kidnapped. Probably, that's my guess. Taken to Russia to be raised as Russians. He's going to go into every city that Russian forces, well, not he personally, but Russian forces are going to go into every city and shoot the resistors, the leaders of all community organizations, civil society organizations, anyone who resists in any way or is said to resist in any way. The children will be taken away. Whole populations will be moved to other parts of Russia. And there will be nothing called Ukraine left.
And let me point out too for everyone that the Russia that will come into being after Ukraine is subsumed will be a much more powerful Russia.
Yes.
With a larger population, significant industry, significant industrial capacity, and within a generation there will be no more memory of Ukraine. It will be gone. And then he will seek to certainly appropriate the Baltic countries.
Yes, which is something even Stalin didn't try to do.
So just building on that, Steve, and then would love to get your perspective as well, Claire. So we're seeing Putin obviously trying to expand his reach. Aside from funding Ukraine, are there other ways to stem his influence?
Oh, sure. Oh, sure. I mean, if we put NATO troops in Ukraine, that would scare him. He would back down. But I don't think the American people would even contemplate that. I mean, yes, I do think that he would, if Putin believed that he would lose his life and his entire military and a large part of Russia, he'd back down. I don't think he's irrational. I don't think he wants a nuclear war. I think that's all a bluff. I do think that if he swallows up Ukraine and makes use of, as Steve pointed out, its ample industrial resources, especially in the East, and then moves into a NATO country, if we are still in NATO, we will end up in a war with Russia. At that point, because NATO is overwhelmingly more powerful than Russia, we would, I think, end up pushing Russia to the point of genuine existential fear. And then I think he could use a nuclear weapon. The time to stop him is now.
Steve, what are your thoughts?
That's exactly right. The United States is overwhelmingly the most powerful military nation in the world, and then combined with our allies, overwhelmingly more powerful. And Putin's bet is on our decadence.
Yes.
What the weak part of our society is right now are our elected officials, are the brokenness of our media, our culture. A decade into everybody having instantaneous connection with every other person, has impacted our society in a lot of ways that are not good. And so Putin sees this. And he is playing a mind game, a propaganda game, and they are winning that. And they have placed a bet on Donald Trump. And this is important to understand. there's so many off the wall conspiracies about Trump and Putin. And I want everybody to appreciate this. Vladimir Putin does not like Donald Trump. Vladimir Putin has contempt for Donald Trump, like he has contempt for all Americans, like he had contempt for Tucker Carlson in the interview. What Vladimir Putin sees when he looks at Donald Trump is a mark, a stooge, a fool, an easy enemy to roll over. He's not in business with Donald Trump. He wants to take advantage of Donald Trump. And he thinks when he assesses American society that its weak underbelly is apathy, it's lassitude. It's that democracy could conceivably put into a position of power somebody so manifestly unprepared for it psychologically, intellectually, emotionally, from a character perspective, that Putin, with no pairs, the weakest hand you could imagine, has the possibility to satisfy his ego as a restoration of Peter the Great and restoring the Russian Empire. Because what he believes is that we are in the deepest valley of weakness that there is, that it can't conceivably endure. So the time to act is now. And aggression comes when people like Putin, like Xi Jinping, look and they say the cost is worth it and we can succeed.
Yes, I think that's exactly right. And Trump does not need to be elected for him to be more devastating to American society than a weapon of mass destruction. Look at the damage he's already done. None of us would have imagined we'd be in the place we are now 10 years ago. It would have been unfathomable. Even the people who were excited about Trump wouldn't have believed how much they would have changed in this amount of time, who they'd become, what they would be saying. The damage that Trump has done is far more than I ever imagined one man being capable of inflicting on the United States. So of course Putin supports him. Why wouldn't he? This is someone who has never recovered from the humiliation of the fall of the Soviet Union, wants to reconstitute it, and grew up thinking of the United States as a despised rival and a threat, has never changed his mind about that, and sees that we're willing to inflict this unbelievable damage on ourselves. Of course he supports it. Doesn't mean, I think they've had a relationship with Trump of some kind since the 1980s, but it doesn't mean that Trump is actually calling Putin and saying, what should I do next, boss? It means that there's a confluence of interest. Trump wants to be elected because he wants to be elected, because he's a man of the most clinically extreme narcissistic personality disorder anyone has ever seen. And Putin wants Trump to be elected. So they work together. Trump says, sure, you want Ukraine, you can have it. And Putin says, sure, you want some well-timed leaks, you can have them. And I expect we're going to see a hell of an October surprise of some kind. There's just too many people who want to see America dysfunctional. And even if Trump loses, we're going to be dysfunctional for quite some time. I mean, he's not going to take that line down.
No, well, he won't concede the election. We'll be in a real crisis.
Yeah, no matter what.
So Steve, on that point, Helen asked, she commented and said that she doesn't believe that Trump will win, but she is worried about the chaos that's going to happen, given that they are threatening potential civil war. So what do you envision happening when he loses, if he loses, and doesn't accept the results again?
I just watched the movie that one of my readers sent me, the movie Civil War, which is a dystopian picture of what would happen if the United States collapses into civil war. And I thought it was a well done movie in some ways, but that's not the scenario I see, because I think that demographically we're just too old for it. You don't get that. It would be the first civil war that has ever occurred in a population as old and as wealthy as ours. What I see as being completely dysfunctional, with sporadic violence, occasional terrorism, and being ungovernable, as we almost are now. I mean, it's important not just to think about Biden versus Trump, but who's going to be in the House, and who's going to be in the Senate. And the GOP, in the wake of Trump's conviction, has been disgusting. It's I think their lowest moment ever. Such a thing as possible. I don't know if anyone has been following what they've been saying on Twitter, but it's disgusting. I've never imagined people who are in a position of responsible authority in the United States saying the kinds of things they've been saying.
Just to build on that, Jerry is asking you, Steve, specifically, what do you think about the Republican Party members who have totally disregarded?
I want to answer that in a second. And so, for everybody, well, I've been involved in a lot of political campaigns. It's what I've done for a living. It's really all I've thought about professionally at some level, right? You replay them in the head. You study them. You study them historically. If the election were tomorrow, Joe Biden would lose. That's okay. Doesn't mean he can't win. But it's like a boat race, a foot race, or a car race, a horse race. If there's two horses in the race, and one horse is wearing green and the other is blue, and green is in front of blue, then blue has to pass green to win. So Biden will have to pass Trump. He has to get ahead in this race. And there are only a few moments that afford opportunities for real dynamic movement in a political campaign. So this debate is of monumental importance. I'm not even really paying attention to the numbers and that underlying reality until 3 days after the debate. And then at that point, we're going to have a really strong indication of where the race is. Now, my overwhelming critique of the American news media is this: it has not been able to conform as a whole to understanding the events of this moment for what they obviously are. Every day is not a new isolated day of happenings. It is part of an ongoing, continuous series of events that has been playing out for 9 years. It is like a river with rapids and current, and where we started and where we are very different points. We have come far down that river. And so all of the coverage in the aftermath of the Trump conviction was in the moment about the news, which was the jury finding of guilt. And so now he's a convicted felon. But the political event that immediately transpired is much more important than that fact finding in the coverage of news. Because what happened when Trump was found guilty is that the third oldest political party in the world, from top to bottom, ranged on a scale from threatening civil war to violence to terrorist attacks to locking up political opponents to demanding names and lists for arrest and imprisonment, or worse, right? Threats of assassination against the judge, against prosecutors, and a wholesale attack as poisonous as the attack made on the election process is made on the judicial process. The truth of the matter is, there were a lot of people in America who pled guilty to felonies yesterday, who were convicted of felonies yesterday. But there is only one person in America who was charged and convicted by a jury who instigated calls for really political revolution, to tear it all down, to burn it all down. Just one: Donald Trump.
Yeah, his attack on the judiciary is every bit as serious as his attack on the election process.
Do you want to wrap up, Steve? Your comment?
I have over my career, I'm a consultant. I was talking to my friend, the Reverend Barber, yesterday, repairers of the breach, the Poor People's Campaign. I said, Reverend, I'm a consultant. I give advice. It's what I do. And so in this moment, when you have people who are attacking um the judge, the system, burn it all down because of a jury finding. What they're attacking are those 12 Americans who were called out of their lives, out of their jobs to do a public service, and they're doing it for power. And when you watch Tim Scott on television with Abby Phillips at CNN, the dissembling, the dishonesty, the lunacy of the answers. And so what this moment brings us to now is not a question of, do you want a convicted felon as president? I don't. I think it's outrageous. But it's so much deeper than that now. It's, do you want a convicted felon sustained by a mob threatening violence to put him in power, threatening punishment, threatening retribution, showing its teeth with no evidence that they don't mean it? And I will say this, and I'm sure Claire will back me up. People will say there are no absolutes, or there's no exception to the rules, but that's not true. I'm going to tell you something that's absolute and absolutely true. There has never been a political movement or power anywhere on earth ever that ran in a democratic election promising to end democracy, promising retribution, promising revenge, promising to lock people up who disagree with them, promising to deport millions of people, that has not done it when they took political power. There are no surprises here. And so we are on that river, and we just came through the rapids and around a bend. And my observation is most people who are covering this don't see that bend.
I agree. I agree. The media isn't any one thing, but our traditional legacy media, I think it's been so concerned with its own economic problems because the advent of the internet has made being a journalist a losing economic proposition. I think it's been so concerned with just trying to stay afloat that it hasn't really been able to consider what should our role be at a time like this. And they're constantly trying to think, how do we appeal to this segment of the market? Maybe if we have more features on African American hair care, we'll get more African American readers. And maybe if we have more recipes, we'll get more suburban women. They're not really thinking big picture about what they need to communicate to their readers and their viewers. There is no foreign news coverage anymore. I mean, literally almost none. If you'll occasionally see something about Ukraine or Israel, well, you'll see a lot about Israel recently, but mostly inaccurate. Incredibly inaccurate. But you're not going to get the kind of panoptic view of the world you would have gotten just from watching one of the big three ABS, CBS, NBC shows for half an hour every evening during the 1960s, because they had 40% of their news hole went to foreign affairs. Now it's less than 2%. It was less than 4% a few years ago, but I'd swear it's less than 2% now. And so I don't think Americans are getting any sense of the wider world and how menacing it looks. And the reasons for this, it's not, people say they hate the media, and Trump gets a lot of mileage out of the idea of the lying media straight from the Nazis, the Lügenpresse. That should have been someone's cue that something was wrong there. Then he starts using these phrases that come straight from the worst parts of history, like America first and lying press. But the point is, it's not the media's deliberately trying to deceive anyone. It's that the economic incentives have completely changed with the advent of the internet. We're in a completely different universe, and it's not realistic to expect the media to operate the way it did when people had more confidence in it. hard though it is for me to admit, as someone who's always thought of herself as a great believer in the benefits of the free market, we have not gotten a better product out of a freer market in media. We just haven't. And we've also created a social media environment that our elected representatives are far too pusillanimous, lobbied up, and out of touch to realize is a poison, one that's creating one that might not be compatible with democracy at all, that is encouraging people to live in completely different epistemological universes. It is now possible to believe anything you feel like believing about the world and find the other 10 people in the world who agree with you and live in that universe, which was not possible before. You had to have some contact with the rest of the country epistemologically. And that's something completely new in human history. We've never done this before. We've never had anything like the internet before. And I don't think we have any sense yet of how this is affecting us and how it's going to shake out. It's as big a transformation as the advent of the printing press. And we know that created quite a bit of friction for centuries, changed everything about what it was to be human. And I think the internet is too. So, but I when I see Congress speaking to the heads of the big tech companies, especially about AI, I have the feeling of watching a dog try to comprehend someone patiently explaining Fermat's last theorem to him. They just can't understand. They do not understand, and they don't want to understand. And that's partly because the intellectual quality of our representatives has gone down, I think, and partly because we now live in a technologically more complex world than we did 100 years ago, and these things are hard. It's very, very hard to find representatives who can understand not just this, but virology and how to regulate things like gain of function research, how to understand pandemics. These are technologically complex, and they can't do it. They don't understand what's going on. So I don't know whether democracy can even keep pace with the level of technological sophistication of our society. It may not be a form of government that can keep. I don't know what would work better. No one's suggested anything to me that I think sounds as if it might do a better job, but there might be a point of technological sophistication at which a society is no longer capable of governing itself well, and that's a very frightening thought.
It sure is. To your point about the decline in the members of Congress, I'll just share a quick story. I was at a movie premiere, a documentary premiere about Christian nationalism in Washington, D.C. a few weeks back, and I sat down next to a Democratic member of Congress, who will remain unnamed, that I know, and sitting next to him was another Democratic member. And I said to him, "How you doing?" He said, "I'm good." He goes, "Much better than so-and-so next to me." He goes, "He grew up with nothing, went to Harvard Law School. He's a Rhodes Scholar. He's got the same fucking job as Lauren Boebert," which I laughed out loud.
Why aren't people ashamed of electing her? Why aren't people ashamed that they chose her to be their representative? That's what I don't understand.
No, I say this all the time, right, to the people of Georgia in Marjorie Taylor Greene's district. I think it should be said more. You people as a collective, and you hate to impose collective assignments of guilt, but as a community of 800,000, you're not pulling your weight for the country. You sent the greatest imbecile out of the 800,000 of you to do serious work in Washington. Shame on y'all. For not stepping up. And same with Lauren Boebert, and the same with Matt Gaetz. The incredible spectacle that played out in that committee hearing, by Chairman Comer. It's all amazing. I wanted to the other day I wrote a piece. It was a letter to an American, and it was authored by Antoine de Saint-Exupéry, who was the author of The Little Prince. And he was a 43-year-old volunteer pilot in the Second World War. He was killed in action, but he wrote a letter that I read for the first time behind Utah Beach in a museum there. And it describes a scene as he was returning to Europe in 1943. And just to close out my part of this tonight, and then let Claire have the last word. I just wanted to set the scene, because it goes to the heart of what we are talking about, to the magnitude of the sacrifices that were made, to the obligations and responsibilities that I think all Americans have. And the scene that I'm going to describe is a 30-ship convoy coming across the Atlantic Ocean. There are 50,000 American soldiers that are being carried across the ocean to fight for the liberation of Europe. I commend everybody to read the entire letter. It's beautiful, but I'm just going to read a short excerpt. And he says, I traveled on board an American convoy. This convoy of 30 ships was carrying 50,000 of your soldiers from the United States to North Africa. When on waking, I went up on deck, I found myself surrounded by this city on the move. The 30 ships carved their way powerfully through the water, but I felt something else besides a sense of power. This convoy conveyed to me the joy of a crusade. I shall always bear witness in the same way to your fundamental qualities. American mothers did not give their sons for the pursuit of material aims, nor did these boys accept the idea of risking their lives for such material aims. I know, and will later tell my countrymen, that it was a spiritual crusade that led you into the war. During this crossing in convoy, mingling as I did with your soldiers, I was inevitably a witness to the war propaganda that they were fed. Any propaganda is by definition amoral, and in order to achieve its aims, it makes use of any sentiment, whether noble, vulgar, or base. If the American soldiers had been merely sent to war to protect American interests, their propaganda would have insisted heavily on your oil wells, your rubber plantations, your threatened commercial markets. But such subjects were hardly mentioned. If war propaganda stressed other things, it was because your soldiers wanted to hear about other things. And what were they told to justify the sacrifices of their lives in their own eyes? They were told of the hostages hanged in Poland, the hostages shot in France. They were told of a new form of slavery that threatened to stifle part of humanity. Propaganda spoke to them not about themselves, but about others. They were made to feel solidarity with all humanity. The 50,000 soldiers of this convoy were going to war, not for the citizens of the United States, but for man, for human respect, for man's freedom and greatness. The nobility of your countrymen dictated the same nobility where propaganda was concerned. How could I forget the great cause for which the American people fought? 80 years on, the sad truth is, too many of our people have forgotten what we fought for, and now it is all imperiled, and there will be a new fight that challenges a new generation of Americans as the price of the amnesia. I hope you have all enjoyed this conversation. I know that I have, and I wanted to leave Claire with the last word and encourage everybody, if you are not already, subscribe to the Cosmopolitan Globalist. It will make you better informed, smarter, and I think really satisfy all of you who are so deeply interested in what's happening in the world. Thank you, Claire.
Thank you very much, Steve. I see that there's a lot of questions that I haven't really answered, or comments too, that I haven't responded to in the chat. And what I'm going to do, because they're really good questions, and some of them are things that I've written about before, and my answer would take longer than we have here. I'm going to write in the form of a question and answer on the Cosmopolitan Globalist, and everyone who left a comment, I will answer or say something about what you said, because I think you're thinking the right way. And I don't know what good that does. I feel very powerless, as I began by saying, but these are important. All of the questions that we've been talking about here, from artificial intelligence to historical memory to what on earth has gone wrong with the intellectual caliber of our representatives, we need to figure out what's going on. I don't pretend to have the answers. I just think these are extremely important questions. And as Herculean as the task is, we cannot give in to despair, because despair is a crime. And because the future is not written, it's possible we'll be able to avoid these terrifying scenarios. They haven't happened yet. So we've got to figure out how to forestall them. But the first step is realizing that we really are at risk.
Hear, hear. And with that, thank you everybody for joining.
Thank you so much, everyone. I'm very touched that you all showed up to hear what we had to say.
Thank you. I'm Steve Schmidt. This is The Warning, and I invite you to subscribe on our Substack, on our YouTube channel. Follow us. Welcome to the community.